Good morning, ladies and gents. Yeah, my name is Simon Hampton. I'm from the University of East Anglia, and I get involved in things like this and other areas of market research when really companies think they're onto something and there's something persisting, and they want to really know this, asking one question: is this, we've found something, is it likely to persist, or is it likely to be temporary? And as a psychologist, my area is biological psychology, and I look for a biological root in what appear to be persistent phenomena. If I can find one, we might be onto something that is likely to continue, or something that has exploited what people want to do anyway. They always wanted to do that, but we're now facilitating it, or it's being facilitated, or not. So psyched and out, it's a tabloid sort of headline, really. We are psyched. John just used the word addicted. I don't think we need to be afraid of that word. There are many forms of addiction that are perfectly healthy. Ask a new mother why she's looking at her child 2 or 3 times a minute, monitoring its breathing and so on and so forth. Clearly addictive behaviour. Is it good? Yes. So I don't think we need to be afraid of the term addiction. And addiction obviously has a psychological foundation. And out. Is our psychology out there now? Is it literally, is our mind in the palm of our hand? I'm going to put it to you that is indeed the case. I've got 4 points really I want to whip through, about 4 minutes each. The cyborg self, the idea that we're tool-using animals. You've got a tool at the end of your arm. It's a Swiss Army knife and it's called a hand. Okay? Think of the number of things you do with your hand. Rub your face, scratch, drink water, pick your nose, scratch your backside, rip things, hammer things, clasp things. It's a Swiss Army knife. You've got one. And I would put it to you that a mobile phone is a Swiss Army knife on the end of the Swiss Army knife. But we can also think about mobile phones as an object and place it. I'm going to get you to think in a moment about where you'd place a mobile phone as a personal object. I'm going to talk about something called what we call embodied cognition, and to show you an amusing picture of something called a homunculus. I'm going to put to you an idea that's very robust in psychology, and that is that our physical states drive our emotional state at least as much as the other way round. That is to say, our body will drive how we feel. I'm going to put it to you that the hand is especially important in this, and with mobile, phablets and tablets, quite literally, this pattern of movements, especially with haptic feedback, itself generates emotional states. And I think there's a particular opportunity there, difficult one to work through, but an opportunity. I'm going to talk about attention spans and try and bust the idea, the myth of the isolated thinker. Reading is very, very unusual human activity. Many people never get the grip of it. It takes thousands of hours to train a human being to do it. It's a very unusual thing to do. Reading is an example of single-focused attention. Historically, it's a very unusual thing. Most people are multi-attention spanners. Multi-screening is a very natural state for a human to be in. Then I'm going to move on to finally something that John just touched on, industrial inertia, as I call it. Why it might be in advertising there's reluctance to just accept the figures that are flooding people's way. What would be the psychological basis for people being resistant to evidence in the advertising industry? Okay, so the cyborg self. What I want you to think about here, we've got a Tracy Emin-like, although I was going to use that image, but when I scrutinised it more carefully, I thought perhaps not at 9 o'clock on a morning, her bedroom scene. But here we've got, I'm still not quite sure Altoids are. Anyone? But here's the contents of a bag, okay? And this is a person. The genius of the Tracy Emin piece was, it's her, she's saying, and yet she's not in the picture. It's a certain type of portrait, and I would suggest you're looking at a portrait here of a human. The point here is, where do we begin and end? So we've got a series of objects there: glasses, toothbrush. A particular favourite of mine is a real curiosity that 2 people could sleep with one another, get up in the morning and be disgusted at the idea they'd use one another's toothbrush. What's going on there, yeah? No matter what was just happening 20 minutes ago, for Christ's sake, don't touch my toothbrush. Let alone my false teeth, embedded in my backside. We can go from the periphery, perhaps, glasses, a pen, through to, say, a wedding ring. At what point? Now, where would you place the mobile in that picture? You'll have your own periphery. If you were a glass wearer, that might be much closer to you than a tooth. I don't know, than a watch. I like watches. I'm sort of fetishistic about them. So for me, the watch is close to me, if that makes sense. But they're all tools of a sort, or they're signifiers of a sort. But the one I'm interested in there is the diary, because I think we can draw a useful analogy between the smartphone and a diary. And I think we can do so because both are records. They're autobiographical, they're friends, they're confidants, right? They're sources of amusement, entertainment. Now, what would you do if you could advertise in someone's diary? Unlike the personal Dear Diary, which has always been rare, most people have never had one. Very few people persist with one over their lifespan. But now everyone has got a mobile phone. Everyone is keeping a diary of a sort. Do you see my point here? To jerk you, what would you advertise in someone's diary? What if you could? What if you knew as it was being written? And as they're writing today, you could cross-reference to what they were writing this time last month. How would you message them? What would you say? What would the message look like? What are the dangers? Would there be times where you just would not want to insinuate yourself into that diary? Yeah? What if they're writing about reflections on a deceased relative? Do you want to advertise to them now? What sort of message would that be? Dark-coloured clothing, perhaps? It's sensitive. There's a real opportunity, I think, if this is useful to you as a thought tool, the diary, the mobile device, and the opportunities it presents, but also the dangers. Embodied cognition and the motor homunculus. The idea here is that posture determines emotional state. It's an old theory. William James, the sort of founder of American psychology, and the German thinker Karl Lang, argued that the common sense, or the intuitive sense that I feel something and then I act out, is incorrect. What it actually turns out is, for biological and evolutionary reasons, my body responds, especially to alarm or excited or sexual states, and then very, very soon after, but afterwards, I become cognitively appraised of what my body is telling me. Okay? A very simple way we do this with undergraduates is to get them to do something like put a pencil in their teeth, which triggers smiling muscles in the face, and then get them to rate images. And sure enough, if you get them to do that, they think the images are more attractive than if you don't put a pen in their mouth. I've never known it not to work. Not to fail, I was about to say. Not to work. Simply by getting that and triggering the smiling muscles, this bodily state, appraise these images, they're more positive about them. Its root is in Greek theatre. The idea that what we call mirror neurons, or we often think of as body language, don't we? You know, you go for a job interview, the advice is always mirror the language of the most powerful person in the room, because it'll make them like you, make them think you're like them. They don't realise that, but that's what they're going to do. And the Greeks had that with faces. So the idea with on this side is Darwin's classic 6 emotions: anger, disgust, fear, and so on. What we've got here in the Greek masks is, in Greek theatre, people would put the masks on, and as you looked at this grotesquely surprised or happy face, you would start to mirror it, and therefore feel the emotional state. So it could be a lousy actor, but you would start to feel it. A lot of comic theatre was like that, Chaplin, Buster Keaton, and so on. Really grotesque facial expressions that the audience would mimic, and they'd start to feel like the actor was wanting them to feel. They couldn't stop it. Or that was the argument, and there's evidence to suggest it. This is a motor homunculus. This is a model of a human being if I was proportioned the way my brain is organised to my sensitivity. So the amount of my brain given over to my hands, look, massive, even compared to my... Look at the lips. And this mirrors it, doesn't it? When you watch people shopping, they go in, they look at something, and then goes the touch, and then ask a furrier. If they don't do this, they're not going to buy it. That's when they really know what it feels like. They put it to their mouth, like a baby. We can have a thing called a sensory homunculus. The sensory homunculus is very similar to that, but it's obscene. And that's the part of the brain that are not just devoted to motor movements, but to sensory. It's very similar, but you can imagine certain changes. My point here is that I think this is key in touch. That the hands, look at them, focus on them. The amount of the brain devoted to the hands, to touch and feel. the amount of information the hands can deliver into a human brain is only matched by the mouth. One might argue a really good tab would be one you'd use with your mouth, right? It just doesn't look pretty, does it? It's not as elegant. The key is that those gestures, like the facial gesture, like a body posture, those gestures and movements, the touch and feel, I think it might be why some brands of mobile device are so genuinely sensual. They are genuinely sensual under the thing. It seems odd to think that glass and plastic can be sensual, but I think the Homunculus is telling us why that's the case. So the feel of the object, the hand movements, haptic feedback, if that's appropriate to what the message is, I think it can genuinely generate emotional states that are subtle. And this is where it gets a bit spooky. Maybe the user themselves don't quite realise why they're feeling as or they're not feeling as so strong they know they feel in a certain way, but it could be enough to trigger further investigation or purchase. Attention span, it's really just tackling head on this point about that somehow multi-screening's odd, something wrong with it. It's old fogies like me in education think there's something wrong. We're not the classical thinker. Look at the posture of the classical Rodin's thinker. He looks miserable. It looks effortful, doesn't it? Yeah? The very activity of locked in. So the point being made about being on the mobile, on the tube, rather than gaze out the window, I'll idle away time. I'm not actually going to sit there thinking of Kant or Aristotle. It really isn't what people do. Getting people to focus precisely like reading, it takes about 3,000 hours to teach a child to comprehend a sentence like that. 3,000 hours. You cannot shut a human being up. Similarly, you can't stop them drawing. No instruction is required to get a 3-year-old to draw that with their fingers. And this is where I think mobile devices in touch are really deeply intuitive, folks. You look at a child in a nursery, give it a pot of paint, give it paintbrushes and see what it does if it's given the option. It will stick its fingers in and it will start smearing. But it will do so in an organised way. And you don't need to teach it. You do need to teach it how to paint with a brush. You do not need to teach it how to paint with its fingers. And there's clearly, if you watch film of it, if you watch a child dip its finger in the paint, start smearing, look at its face, it starts to exhibit happiness. It almost instantly triggers a smile on a child's face. Last point, new skin for the old ceremony. It's an album titled by Leonard Cohen, but I'm not going to be that dour. What I'm trying to get at here is one of the things I'm interested in is always asking the question, is any new technology doing something genuinely novel? I would argue the car doesn't do anything the horse doesn't do, it just does it faster. I would argue the jet airliner does something hitherto unprecedented. It warps time. It's a time warp machine. It gets you from one completely geographical location to another in amounts of time that are mind, life, time bending, whereas the car isn't. I think a lot of what's going on with mobile, it's actually unleashing latent desire. It's not creating desire, it's unleashing it. I think we've always been perpetual shoppers in the 20th century. Catalogues show us that. Mobile phones, pads are just revealing it. But there's another sense in which I want to explore the idea of new skin for the old ceremony. I'm gathering from folk that there's resistance in the advertising agency, as we've just seen, to mobile advertising. I asked a group of my American students just a couple of weeks ago, one ad they'd noticed since they've been in this country, they came up with the Flora ad. The cartoon with the kids and the mum and dad are having a bit hanky-panky in the bedroom, yeah? We counted, of the 4 key devices, earworms and so on, that in 42 seconds they'd packed in 12 key points. Laugh, humour, sentimentality and so on, and yet they're not optimised for mobile. A fantastic TV ad, noticed by incomers, but no mobile. The thing about industrial inertia, I think, is there is a personal element to it. Here we are. Telling this man that he is redundant is not just bad economic news. Telling people who are invested in screen and radio advertising that mobile is the way to go isn't just threatening to their job in some way. I do think there's an existential issue. I see it in academia all the time. Tell a man my age that my theory is redundant and it's over. You're now telling me the way I fed my kids and paid my mortgage was untrue. You know, that was based on a lie of some sort. I do think there's a genuine challenge there. You're telling them something There's a judgment on their very being. And I think if you want growth in any change, we have to look at research on minority influence. The thing about conformity, conventionality, and so on, it overlooks this point, and you're all an example of it. Where does change come from if we're as conformist and obedient as us psychologists would have it? It's through something called minority influence. Change comes through the beginning of the lone voice. And all the research on minority influence really boils down to these things. People are influential when they begin in a minority against resistance when they're relentlessly consistent. So I'm sorry to be Blairist here, but consistency, consistency, consistency. In an organisation, deciding on what the message is and sticking to it repetitively over and over and over. Consistency gets translated as confidence. That's what people hear. They might not like what you're saying, but they're sure you're confident in it because you keep saying the same thing. And the other one with minority influence is being flexible towards an altruistic outcome. I'm consistent in the message, but how we achieve it I'm open-minded about. How we go about getting an optimized site I'm open-minded about. And the other one is the influential minority is seen to be altruistic. If the signal being given out is that they're self-serving rather than orientated towards the organisation, it's much less powerful, if powerful at all. So if you, in your organisation, at some level or another, feel you're in a minority on promoting mobile, consistency, 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 flexible in how you achieve the goal, but be clear on what it is, and be sure that you're getting the message out that is good for the organisation and not just for you. Thank you very much indeed, folks.